This story is called The Final Hour of Nicholas Sutton. In it, Nicholas reflects on events in his own life that are brought to his mind as he hears the details of people who precede him on the celestial departures board. The Final Hour of Nicholas Sutton. The celestial departures board is far more active than that of even the most bustling airport or railway station. Therefore, the decision was taken long ago to establish separate boards for the various regions of the world. Even the Canadian board, not one of the busiest, must accommodate almost one departure every minute, and so departures can be posted only 1 hour in advance. Although departures are occasionally delayed, as at airports and railway stations, they are never cancelled, since mechanical problems and inclement weather do not avert celestial departure. Consequently, the control room is constantly alive with the rattling sound of departures being updated minute by minute. At 4:02, the name Nicholas Sutton appeared for the first time at the very bottom of the board, at the same moment as the state of Emily Lynch's changed from on time to departed. Emily's departure had been anticipated for several weeks. In her 95th year, the fall that had broken her hip had left her hospitalized and bedridden. Pneumonia was almost inevitable, and perhaps the compassionate outcome. Nicholas Sutton was in the final stages of colon cancer. Mercifully, the pain was now under control, and the doctor's careful adjustment of the dose of morphine had left him in that comfortable condition somewhere between dozily asleep and dreamily awake. For the first time in weeks, his mind was just clear enough for him to reflect on some of the events of his life. His daughter Susan and son-in-law Bryce had come in at lunchtime, but had just left for home to be ready for the arrival of their youngest child, Kyle. They expected to be back for another visit with Nicholas tomorrow. Nicholas's mind drifted back to his own school days. How long ago it seemed, as indeed it was. He recalled his days in elementary school, and wondered about Elaine, whom he had not thought of for over 60 years. Elaine with the wide smile, brown eyes and her curly hair. His first crush, they were both 11. "One day I'll marry you," he remembered telling her. He'd no idea what happened to her, but he hoped that she'd found someone as good for her as his own Evelyn had been for him. Back in the elementary school classroom, he recalled how fierce Mrs. Joblin had seemed, how he'd met her years later in Woolworths, only to discover a sweet little old lady, barely 5'2". Perhaps she'd mellowed after she retired, he mused. At 4:05, the nurse came in to check on him. She fluffed up his pillow, smiled and left. At this precise moment, the rattling of the departures board indicated that baby Johnson had now departed. Poor baby Johnson, who had breathed for only a few minutes as she turned from pink to blue while her frail heart tried desperately but ultimately unsuccessfully to pump sufficient blood to her body's organs. The staff in the maternity unit were readying a memory box to include a picture of Jill holding her baby, the only one they would ever have, her precious bundle, other than those taken by the ultrasound technician during her pregnancy. Meanwhile, Nicholas mused on the last weeks of Evelyn's life. Her end too had been hard and painful. He would not be sorry when this was all over, as his dearest wish was to be reunited with Evelyn once again. In truth, it had been more arduous for him and Susan to watch that vibrant wife and mother disappear before their eyes as dementia took its toll. Evelyn had always been a stylish dresser, which made it all the worse to see her in Forest Manor long-term care in mismatched sweatpants and cardigan, the latter stained with blue. When the end came, and well-meaning acquaintances opined that she was now in a better place, it was hard to disagree with the cliché. Departures were often spaced irregularly. By 4:09, Nicholas had moved up only 4 places on the board, in part because Chief Dan Eaglefeather, originally scheduled for 4:08, was now posted delayed 11:27. The chief was determined to hang on despite the unfavourable odds until his son Matthew arrived from Saskatoon. However, the board rattled vigorously at 4:10 at the moment of the simultaneous departure of Antoinette Lebeuf and her husband Philippe. The couple had made the unfortunate decision to take a late-season snowmobile shortcut across the rotten ice of Lac Saint-Jean in order to visit Antoinette's sister Marie for a dinner that would forever remain uneaten. Nicholas and Evelyn had visited the Lac Saint-Jean region years before, when Susan and Eric were small. They packed everything into the station wagon and spent 2 weeks camping in the area. It was a charmed vacation on which, at least in Nicholas's memory, the sun shone every day, children never squabbled, the outdoor eaten food was unvaryingly delicious, and even the mosquito seemed to be relatively benign. One evening, wishing a little privacy from the children asleep in the tent, he and Evelyn had stolen into the field adjacent to the campground. He had taken off all his clothes and lain down naked on his back in the dew-soaked grass, where they had made love with Evelyn astride him, silhouetted against the stars. At 4:15 came another on-time departure, this time Maurice Lemon, teenage son of Bill and Patty Lemon. He'd climbed into the grain silo in order to free a clogged auger. The auger had been turned off, but Maurice had fallen into the quicksand of small grains. His struggles to free himself had only resulted in him being dragged in deeper and deeper, and he suffocated before he could be extricated. Nicholas remembered the suffocatingly hot summer nights in the story-and-a-half house in which he and Evelyn had raised Susan and Eric. Their first home had been built in the late 1950s when insulation was minimal and domestic air conditioning was unknown. The upper story in particular was like a furnace on sweaty Ontario summer nights, and the four of them would often sleep on the back porch to escape the heat inside. He recalled as in a dream the flashing fireflies under the maple tree in the garden. Jerome Middleton's departure at 4:22 occurred when he succumbed to the gunshot wound he had suffered the previous night. Jerome had been on his way home after seeing his girlfriend Shayla safely to her Etobicoke apartment. Police said it was a drive-by shooting. Jerome was just an innocent bystander. Nicholas had always been terrified of guns, although he had no particular reason for this. He'd grown up in an eminently safe, some would say boring, middle-class neighbourhood. He wasn't particularly squeamish about killing innocent creatures, but he had no interest in trying his luck when his friend's older brother Thomas used to shoot the starlings on the neighbour's roof with a pellet gun. And much later, when a friend and law enforcement offered him the chance to try his luck at the police shooting range, he'd simply declined politely. A near continuous rattling of the departure board at 4:30 revealed that Nicholas had moved up a further 12 places. His own departure was still 5:02 on time. The most recent name to disappear was that of Martin Bando Burden, who choked to death on a chicken bone at his local Mary Brown's. Evelyn always insisted on preparing all their food from scratch. As she proclaimed loudly and often, you never knew what they put in the food in these fast food places. Nicholas, however, had an occasional but secret craving for Mary Brown's chicken, which he regarded as both the greasiest and the tastiest, the ideal antidote to Evelyn's wholesome and nutritious offerings. What now insinuated themselves into his mind were the occasions when Evelyn spent a couple of days and nights with Susan and Bryce to give them a respite from childcare. These allowed him to delight in the oleaginous delicacy, but also required him to double down on the healthier dinner-time offerings Evelyn had left for him in the fridge. Fortunately, he'd always had a good appetite. Clickety-clickety-click. 4:37, with that the status of Oliver Snow changed from on time to departed. The expression "no muss, no fuss" hardly applied to poor Oliver, who upon receiving the diagnosis of a grade 4 glioblastoma, had that very afternoon chosen to throw himself into the path of speeding Via Rail passenger train at Brockville Station. There was much muss, and it caused a great fuss on the busy passenger and freight route westwards from Montreal. In one of his more lucid moments, Nicholas wondered, irrelevantly, whether his own life had also been a mess. Well, it had certainly not been planned. He joined the RCAF after high school. During that time, stationed in Germany, he completely lost touch with Evelyn O'Connor, his high school sweetheart. He'd rather drifted career-wise after his time in the military, which had not been that of a glamorous flyboy, but that of a lowly mechanic. Eventually he got his civilian papers and settled down as an auto mechanic with McDonald's Supertest, remaining there through its changes of name and ownership as Mike's BP, Brandon's PP, and finally Brandon's Repair, when BP sold its Canadian business to the newly formed Petro-Canada. Who was he working for when he reconnected with Evelyn, by then the widowed Evelyn Drake, he wondered. Max Drake had died suddenly, and it was only by chance that she chose McDonald's Supertest, or was it Mike's BP at the time, to service her 72 Pinto. Been an awkward reunion, as there had never been really a proper goodbye when Nick in those days, had joined the military. I guess she eventually forgave me, he mused, thinking of their nearly 40 years of happy marriage. Jason Lee's was the departure that was scheduled for 4:43. Jason was the spoiled offspring of Hong Lee, one of the first wave of Chinese immigrants from Hong Kong in the late 1980s. He'd lived a short life of excessive affluence, thanks to the successful careers of his thrifty but adoring parents. The BMW Series 2 Cabriolet had been a 21st birthday present for the overindulged Jason. He'd wrapped it around a tree at 120 kilometers an hour earlier that afternoon, while showing it off to his girlfriend Lucy Wong. Her departure was tentatively scheduled for later this evening, pending the outcome of surgery. Nicholas remembered unbidden the worst day of his own life. Eric had always been headstrong and a risk-taker. Now Nicholas was taken back to that evening 12 years ago, when 2 OPP officers had appeared on the doorstep of his home and asked if they might come in for a moment. They had bad news. Eric had been on a March break vacation in British Columbia with 2 friends. He'd been in an accident. How was he? Where was he? Unfortunately, said the older officer, it was worse than that. Eric had been snowboarding off-piste at Whistler Mountain. He jumped from a narrow ridge and landed and impaled on a tree. He died in the medevac helicopter en route to hospital in Vancouver. Evelyn's reaction was even more devastating than his. She'd been inconsolable, completely unable even to consider what arrangements should be made for her son's funeral. These details were left to Nicholas, who was torn between his own preference for something simple but dignified, Evelyn's prompting for something nice, and the funeral director's intention to make a profitable sale. The consequential solid oak casket was undoubtedly handsome, but unnecessarily fine-looking for its destination at the crematorium. It had been months before Evelyn returned even to a semblance of normality. Nicholas had always wondered whether the shock had contributed to the onset of her dementia. A pall of sadness hung over the household, not even completely dispelled by the engagement and marriage of Susan and Bryce. Even Christmas seemed to have become muted, though the worst was the first year when Evelyn had set a place at the dinner table for the absent Eric. The scheduled hour for the departure of Bishop Megan Morgan was 4:49. It arrived and her name was removed from the head of the departures board as she went to be with her Maker. She'd been consecrated as bishop only a month before. Members of her former congregation at St. Anne's were already grief-stricken by the loss of their beloved pastor. Now their loss would be felt even more keenly. Nicholas and Evelyn had never been churchgoers. Nicholas had wondered for these past few years, and especially since Evelyn's death, whether there might be something more than just this physical life, for he could not say specifically that he believed in God. Like many of his generation, he considered himself spiritual, without ever defining what that might mean. He did, however, have a belief, or was it a hope, or maybe a longing, that when his time came he would meet his beloved Evelyn on the other side, though again the other side of what was more than a little nebulous. During his time here in the hospital, he'd been visited on occasion by the hospital chaplain, a decent sort, thought Nicholas. Pastor Dan had accepted that Nicholas was not a Christian believer, and was more than willing to talk to Nicholas, at least on the days when his meds allowed the necessary lucidity. On one occasion, the pastor had asked if he might say a prayer for Nicholas. He'd done so with the utmost tact, without bringing Jesus into the equation. He'd asked simply that Nicholas might find rest for his soul, and that when the time came for him to leave this world, he would know that he had lived a good and honest life, faithful to his beloved Evelyn, and that he might be remembered fondly by all he left behind. Nicholas had found the prayer comforting. As he looked back on it, he hoped that the pastor's words might be true. He really did hope that Susan and Bryce might remember him with fondness. They might consider him to have been a good father and father-in-law, and likewise the 3 grandchildren. The drowning death of John Nutley at 5:01 was marked by the customary rattling of the departures board. John had been swept off the fishing boat on which he was first mate by a rogue wave, as they fished for halibut off Porto Basque, Newfoundland. He was immediately lost in the swirling seas, which tumbled him to his death beneath their surface, even though he was wearing his flotation device. Nicholas's thoughts became gradually more diffuse, began to feel as though he was lying in a warm bath. The water covered him completely, although in his vision he knew that he was not drowning. Instead, the liquid seemed to act as balm for all his troubles, the pain associated with his cancer, and the more generalized aches and pains of getting older. All seemed to disappear as the water took on the silky sensation of an emollient. Gentle figures seemed to massage away every ache and every pain. At 5:01:30, the pain had now receded completely, along with the last of his worries. He saw a lighted pathway before him, down which he seemed not just to be travelling, but also accelerating. People were standing beside the path, beckoning him on. Among them he recognized his parents, as well as Grandma and Grandpa Sutton, some school friends, and Brandon, his boss at the repair shop. And at the end of the road he could see Eric, and farther away Evelyn waiting for him, her arms outstretched, her hair down around her shoulders, and her face wreathed in smiles. Home at last. 5:02. Clickety-clickety-clackety. With the efficiency that earthbound folks associate with Swiss railway stations, the main citizen Nicholas Sutton disappeared from the departures board at precisely 5:02, replaced with the next entry, 5:04, Heinrich Müller on time. Heinrich was taking advantage of the legislation on medical assistance in dying in order to end his suffering from advanced Lou Gehrig's disease. Drugs had already been injected,